Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Over these past 2 days, you heard about a scheme. And this scheme involved a plan to burn down Flinders Aluminum and collect the insurance money to save the company from financial ruin. And the actors of this scheme were Mr. Jackson, Mr. Avery, and Miss Peterson. You're wondering, what's the motivation behind this scheme? Well, the company had lost $1 million over the past 2 years. There was a $400,000 loan that was due on November 28th, 2019. And Mr. Jackson tried to renegotiate this loan multiple times in October, but those negotiations failed. Additionally, Mr. Jackson even tried asking his wife for money, but it was from an account that was meant for their children's future, so she obviously said no. He was desperate for a quick, easy solution to his problems. So who were the actors of this scheme? Well, you heard from Miss Peterson. And Miss Peterson came from Yafink, where there was just a fire at, and she was friends with Mr. Avery, who had also worked at Yafink. And she is the one who personally approached Mr. Jackson about having a solution to his financial problems. You also saw from her resume that she had worked 4 years at a fire insurance company as an administrative assistant. And you heard from Miss Williams that she overheard Miss Peterson talk to Mr. Jackson and tell him specifically, I quote, "I know a man named George Avery who can solve all your financial problems. George is a real torch. He could light up this business for you." All that language supports Mr. Avery being an arsonist. And what was Miss Peterson's motivation for getting involved in this? Well, she was going through some financial difficulties, as she told you in her testimony. And Mr. Jackson told her that if they were successful, he was going to make her a shareholder of the company when it went public. So the totality of the circumstances shows that she was involved in this scheme. And then the next actor we heard about, was Mr. Avery, who died in the fire. And Chief Olson had testified that he thought Mr. Avery was actually involved in 3 different fires. Because 2 weeks after he had joined Yafink, the warehouse burned down. 6 weeks after he started working at Fast, their warehouse burned down. And then 9 weeks after working at Flinders, the Flinders warehouse burned down. Additionally, what was his motivation for doing this? Well, Mr. Jackson gave him an initial $10,000 to start working at the company and promised him, if the plans were successful, that he'd give him $100,000. Remember, Mr. Avery's background is historically connected to accusations of arson already. And the Flinders fire is just another example of one of those connections. And then you heard from Mr. Jackson. And you've heard how Mr. Jackson is an established liar. He lied to Miss Williams for 3 years, as you heard from her testimony, as he told her that he was going to leave his wife for her. And he lied to his own wife of the affair that he was having with Miss Williams for 3 years. He was a liar who was desperate to get out of a financial situation for a company that he dedicated 12 years of his life to. And then you heard about the business plan. The plan to solve all these financial problems that was apparently legitimate However, all of these plans were destroyed conveniently in the fire. There were no backups on the computer. Additionally, Mr. Anderson, who is vice president of the First Trust Bank, never received a copy of these business plans, as he testified that he requested because the bank was thinking about investing in the project. However, Mr. Jackson never told Ms. Williams or Ms. Peterson to send over those plans after he made his initial interest in them. So essentially, you have to rely on testimony to prove the existence of these plans. This testimony is coming from people who are invested in this scheme, and one of them who's a proven liar. All you know that there was a vague plan to retool the factory from making aluminum parts for buildings to automobiles. So let's talk about the night of the fire. Remember that 1 month prior to that, Mr. Jackson testified that he actually increased the fire insurance policy by $500,000. Now, on November 16th, you heard from Ms. Williams testify about that night of how the workers had all left at 6:45, and then she heard machinery going on in the operating room. That was strange because everyone had already left. So she started to go downstairs to check it out, and she testified that Mr. Jackson ran into her, and he was upset and surprised of her being there, and immediately told her to leave. That very night, the warehouse burned down. Mr. Avery was the only one in the building at the time that the fire burned down the building. And then you heard from the expert, Chief Olson, who has 25 years of fire investigation experience and 5 years as the chief of the Nita City Fire Department, and he was the one to actually conduct the investigation into the Flinders fire, as well as the Fass and Yaphank fires. And he connected Mr. Avery to all 3 fires. He also concluded that all usual accidental causes have been ruled out in the Flinders fire, and concluded that this was an arson set by Mr. Avery. And you even heard from Mr. Pincus that Mr. Avery's background should be looked into, and that it was, I quote, disquieting. So now, ladies and gentlemen, you have enough information to make the determination that this was an arson. The Mismo Fire Insurance Company did not breach their contract with Flinders Aluminum. The defendant, Mismo Fire Insurance, has the burden of proof to prove to you by the preponderance of the evidence that this was an arson. And preponderance of the evidence means more likely than not, which is a mere 51%. So more likely than not that this was an arson. And the elements I want you to pay attention to in the jury instructions are the following. That if the fire was caused by an act of arson, you'll write yes. And if the plaintiff or its agents acted deliberately to cause the fire, you will write yes. You'll write yes for both of these questions, and that is enough to find a verdict for the defendant. Again, all you need is 51% or more of a belief that this was an arson for you to find a verdict for the defendant. And what I want you to remember, finally, when you go into deliberations tonight is this, that Mr. Jackson, Mr. Avery, and Ms. Peterson came together and formulated this scheme to come up with this bogus business plan to cover up for their real plan to burn down the Flinders aluminum factory and collect the insurance money in order to save the company from financial ruin, and their personal motivations as well. And if Mr. Jackson is lying and cheating on the women in his life, what makes you think that he's not also lying and cheating with the businesses in his life? Thank you.